Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of SaaS Leaders Lounge. Today, we're here with Tony Rafetto, Director of Customer Success at AppsFlyer. Hi, Tony. How are you doing?
Great. How you doing, Paris?
I'm fine, thank you. Great for you to join us today, and I would love just to understand a bit more about your background for the guests. If you could just maybe give us an overview to how you ended up in your role as a Director of Customer Success, that would be an amazing starting point, and then we'll dive into some amazing questions.
Yeah, so I started at AppsFlyer actually about 8 years ago. We were still about a 50-person company at the time, and we had just raised a round of funding, and they were looking to expand operations in the US. We had a couple people in the San Francisco office. We were looking for our first hire in New York. I was at an agency at the time, and they had reached out to me, and they told me when I started that I would have an office and that there would be other people that would start with me because they wanted to grow the team. Of course, startup life, neither of those two things happened. So I was working out of my apartment by myself in New York for the first little while, and then we took off. We grew massively. We hired a sales team. Um, we are now 1,500 people, and I've been able to kind of grow with the company. So that's where I ended up.
And in those 8 years you've been at AppsFly, it's amazing to see how much growth there's been. A round of funding after a round of funding, and now, uh, from a perspective of growth, would you say that the company is at Series C now? Or?
I think we're in E round actually, or F technically. But it's been interesting because I think some people in the space, they'll take their money because they need to grow or they need to kind of to take it on to survive. I think for us, it's been a lot more about being strategic with the partners that we take on, knowing where we want to go. So I think our last round would have been with Salesforce Ventures during the pandemic, and it was maybe just a smaller one for more strategic purposes. So yeah, I think we've always had a good natural momentum that's meant that we can use it for growth purposes more than for staying alive.
Amazing. And I know it's almost 300 million in funding that the company has raised, and a lot of it will go into product development and focusing on the roadmap. Any growing company needs to do that. Has that been a pivotal part of AppsFly's success to date, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think so for sure. I think one of the other ways that you think about it, it's like we're in a small industry. And so when you look at how we're working with our competitors, you don't always have to be the most absolutely incredible company in the world. You need to be a better company than the team you're competing against. And so, like, I think the phrasing "category king" is a really great example of it, where or a great definition. The book Play Bigger talks a little bit about this, where you want to become that sort of category defining product in that market. And the MMP, that mobile measurement provider, is kind of that category that only really has a few players. And so can we be better than the MMP next to us? And also, what does that market look like? And sometimes theoretically it means like take an investment because somebody wants to invest in MMPs. You want to be the one they invest in, not another one.
If I'm right, they are focused around mobile attribution and marketing analytics to help the marketers to make better decisions. And how have AppsFlyer positioned themselves to be leaders in that space, which they are, I guess, at the moment?
Yeah, so basically, when you think about MMPs, you think about like partners with or being a partner with the different networks that we work with. So Facebook kind of defined the category when they started out on the mobile app install track that they took. Like they really heavily invested in mobile. They basically defined how like best in class mobile app install attribution and optimization and everything worked. And so they started working with MMPs, companies like us, because not everybody wanted to directly implement Facebook's code into their app. And they would rather work through a third party that would be able to kind of liaison and share that data back to Facebook, but also share it with any other network that they worked with. So if I'm a marketing person and I want to work with Google, I want to work with Facebook, I want to work with Iron Source, I want to work with AppLove and Liftoff, whoever, I don't want to implement all of their code into my app. I want to implement one code, that's the MMP, and that MMP will then share the data back to the different providers and be kind of a holistic, universal reporting tool and source of truth. So consistent logic and consistent reporting, despite all the discrepancies and differences between all the other players.
I understand. And being now valued as a unicorn is definitely exciting times, and being a part of that growth and that success is definitely, I guess, something that you're very proud of. But when you initially started, if I'm right, you came in as an account executive, and I would love to hear about your journey, how it kind of shifted towards architecture and then back in towards more of a custom success role, and how important that was for you.
Yeah, and actually, like the account executive role is a bit of a misnomer maybe at my last company because it was really like the day-to-day point of contact for our customers. So I worked at an agency called Essence Digital, and we did all of Google's digital advertising. So I was essentially the point person for the customer who was the AdWords team, and I was advertising Google AdWords on Google AdWords. So on one hand, it's potentially one of the most lucrative products in the world that I was advertising. On the other hand, it was Play-Doh, it was monopoly money because all the money was essentially coming from AdWords and going back into AdWords. So haven't done any real advertising in that sense, but that's kind of how I got started. I was writing code and I was making scripts that would kind of like automate my job and my reporting and things like that. And so AppsFlyer came calling, and they were obviously a little bit more of a technical product. They were about the analytics and the data and everything associated to it. That was sort of my bread and butter, my background from my master's program and from my undergrad. And so, uh, I came in and was that same kind of point person for our customers. We didn't have as many customers at the time, and customers didn't have contracts. They didn't need to sign up. They were pay per use. They would use our product. They didn't need to sign a contract, sorry. So they would pay per use. They would use our product, and then the more they used, the more they would pay. And as we hired a sales team, the sales team really didn't know the product very well. They didn't have a good way of understanding it. Obviously, the resources and enablement and all that stuff that you would think in a modern sales enablement organization, they weren't there yet. And so they would basically pull me into conversations. And I would be in basically every single conversation that a salesperson had. And one, it got me really familiar with the product. It got me really familiar with the kind of questions that people had. And then it kind of like turned into a solutions architect role. So basically being that like technical person that's helping implement onboard. At some points, I was writing documentation because we didn't have all the documentation that we needed, providing resources to engineering. And then, from there, as we had so much success selling, then we had these customers. So I was managing the customer. So I was the customer success manager, the solutions architect, the implementation person, and then had to hire people because we had so many accounts. So then I was hiring people and, trying to help them learn the product and do all the same things over again. And it was just kind of a constant game of playing catch up with both the accounts and, the team members and making sure they knew everything too. So that's kind of how it happened. It was much more a sense of urgency and need than uh, a grand plan, I guess.
And in a startup, I guess many people know the phrase "you're always wearing many hats," and it does teach you, a new set of skills and being able to manage tight work deadlines with a lot of high pressure. And this led you to then move into customer success, I guess, once the functions start to establish. And how important was it to build the customer success team when you look at where they was 4 or 5 years ago to where they are today, and the size of the customers they have? How important was having a customer success team to really do the aftercare stuff with them and be their trusted advisors in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I know the customer success department is kind of coming under a lot of scrutiny these days, especially with revenue being so tight in a lot of SaaS organizations. But I mean, we had the advantage, I think, at least where our leaders were always very customer focused. We were probably one of the we were one of the early adopters of the customer or chief customer officer role. So, the guy who I was kind of working with very early on, based out of our headquarters, he became our chief customer officer, and so we always had that kind of that impetus and that value that we wanted to make sure customers were supported. I think also what I would say is that because there's such a gap between maybe what the product starts as, almost as like an MVP, that sort of basic product that you build, to where you need to go. And I think what often happens is customer success kind of ends up filling in some of that gap to support it from a technical perspective and from a documentation perspective and understanding it. And a lot of things that customer success people get, they're not just like, how do I help you work with the product? It's how do we improve our documentation? How do we improve our feature set? How do we improve pretty much everything across the board? And so I think that's where customer success was like really critical for us, especially as our product became more complicated, more capable, and we worked with a more diverse set of customers too. So it's kind of funny because early on, like when you think about what I needed to do as a customer success manager, I was selling the account and then I was onboarding the account and then I was managing the account. I didn't need to have a handover. I didn't need to record any information anywhere. I didn't need to, and so now we've created a much more sophisticated structure where you have a salesperson, and then that salesperson will work with a solutions architect who's pre-sales. Those people will eventually help the solutions architect will onboard the account. The CSM will pick up the account once it's closed, and then an AM will get the account from the AE. So now you have a handover both of the SA and the CSM and the AE and the AM, and suddenly you're in a world where you've never even talked to the account, whereas previously you would have been selling it. And so all of those pieces along the way, I mean, they I think two key things really start to build out. One is it becomes a team sport, not an individual sport. So how are you playing that team sport? And then two, what are those kind of steps along the way that you need to make sure you're handing over the customer information, and like you need to make sure they're completing through that customer journey to get value out of your product. And that wasn't maybe always as much the case in the early days when people were just buying it up, they were using what they needed, and it was a very clear and easy kind of proposition.
And as you move, I guess, more towards the subscription model, it's all about making sure that you can reduce churn rates, but more importantly, as you said, really work with the customers with things like surveys and having regular one-to-ones, whether that's monthly or quarterly or even weekly, depending on the account, right? To really understand where they are in their journey and make sure that the product is really fulfilling their needs. And who better than the customers to tell you, how to improve the product, right? Because they're the ones using it. They're the ones seeing where the gaps are for them. And it's you working with them and feeding it back to the product team, to executive leadership on this is how we can improve the product. And I guess having that great commitment to the customers and good communication and flexibility within the team to share those thoughts and feedbacks of how the company mature and grow over time, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because like you think about us being in a new space, and I've heard people kind of call us as an innovative company, and I kind of feel like that's a bit of a misconception, and not to be critical of the company, but what I mean by that is that I think early on, like I said, we created an MVP, basically something that works, that needs to be developed and needs to kind of evolve based on our customer engagement and feedback. And so what our business did a really good job of wasn't necessarily building new things. It was seeing what needed to be updated and coalesced and sort of managed based on what customers were asking for. And so we were really good at taking that feedback and kind of turning it into successful products. It's how we built our fraud solution. It's how we built our audiences capabilities. It's how we built, the whole robust attribution service that we have today. It's not like we're going out and like imagining some product from nowhere and just like creating it and sharing it with the market. And suddenly everybody's like, wow, this is amazing. There's so much more of a synergistic relationship. And that also comes through because, again, we work with thousands of partners. We work with 5,000 different partners, if not more. Facebook obviously being one, Google, Twitter, and so on, they don't operate in a vacuum. The way that this all works, it's based on the tech, it's based on the industry, it's based on the privacy security information. So it's super critical for us when we're working with all these different vendors and networks and so on to one, be that voice of consistency that people know kind of how things work and how they could work and how we can kind of partner with them, but also to listen to them and say, what is the challenge that we need to solve here and build based on that. And that's where I think really a lot of the growth has come from.
Great. And something you mentioned a little bit earlier, I just wanted to go back to. You mentioned that the customer success function's a bit under fire. And when we look at how critical it is for, as I said earlier, reducing churn rate, but more importantly, reducing the cost of customer acquisition, why would you say, in your own opinion, that there is so much pressure on customer success as a function, and why do people feel that it's not important? Because from my perspective, and I guess for many sales leaders, it is something that needs to remain and to be there to make sure that they have that point of contact with the customers and can make sure that they're having a good customer experience, which is more and more important in today's, climate.
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons why it's kind of coming under fire. And actually, the CEO of Snowflake, Frank Slootman, he wrote a little bit about this in his book, Amp It Up. And what
I
he
saw.
basically says, yeah, 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 what he says is basically like, one, I want support to be a part of the product and the engineering organization because I want to work it all the way up through, and kind of what we said a moment ago, like you want that feedback. So can support deliver that feedback to product, or in our case, oftentimes it's the CSMs. It's the ones that are managing the conversation, they're understanding the client needs. And then on the other side, having that AM, that salesperson manage the relationship. And so the support's more detailed on technical issues and so on, and the AM is the one owning the relationship and driving the revenue. And I mean, I think that one of the key reasons why CS is coming under fire is because it's not always easy to tie a revenue amount to it. And oftentimes CSMs aren't owning revenue or aren't owning the renewals themselves. So in that view, it's really easy to consider CS to be a cost rather than like a growth, like a sales function would be. You invest a certain amount, you get a certain amount back. And so if you're looking at CS as a cost and you're like let's say a CEO or whatever in your company, and you say, okay, well, CSMs are 5%, 10% of my ARR. How do I reduce the cost of that expense? And so I think it's just really easy when you're looking at a high level to view it that way. But like I completely agree with you too, where we see customer success being so valuable is that they're kind of smoothing that relationship along. They're understanding the customer in a way that maybe an AM isn't doing as well or a support engineer isn't doing as well. But they're also, and this is where some of the criticism comes in too, they're also maybe making up for some of the gaps in what the product should be. I mean, the angle there is, I guess, your product should be able to function completely independent. Like it shouldn't be so complicated to use your
Yeah.
product that you need somebody telling you every day how to make it happen. And so when your product's complicated, maybe the solution isn't a customer success solution, maybe it's a product solution. And I think that's where some of the heat comes to.
But as the Snowflake CEO mentioned, it could be, aligned to support, for example. But then the question then becomes, where does support start and where does it end? And then you have to consider, what kind of people are you then hiring for support? How technical are they going to be versus being able to build those relationships and manage all of the tasks that they do in their day-to-day job on top of the customer success work, on top of the AM work. It then becomes almost impossible for them to manage everything. So it's a hard line to draw, right?
Yeah, and I think when I look at it, like I think part of the reason why it's such a fun debate is that it's not necessarily that there's a right answer for each company.
Yeah.
I kind of look at it like, what are the specific tasks that an organization needs to do with their customer? Like, how many different issues are they dealing with? How many different product problems are they dealing with? How many different relationship conversations or business desired outcome conversations, or executive reviews, or trainings, or working with the product day in day out. How many different products are they working with? That kind of thing. And so you look at all like the sort of pieces within it that are your interactions with the customer, and that's kind of your customer journey. And you break it down and you say, well, who owns all of that? And you can kind of, if you're starting from scratch, which nobody ever is, you can kind of play around with it a little bit. Like, okay, well, these trainings, or getting a customer to perform this, and this action, which will give them value with the product, those need to be performed by the CSM, or maybe they can be performed by the onboarding specialist, or maybe they actually could be and should be performed by the support engineer. And so I think what makes it so complicated is just thinking, what are those tasks that you're engaging in, and who is the best person that's going to be lined up skills wise and resource wise, and also uh, prioritization or reward wise. Who's getting paid out. You mentioned support engineers a second ago. Support engineers often are crushing tickets. Like, if you're crushing a ticket, can you deal with the complexities to implement the product, or to update the product based on the feedback a customer is giving? Maybe not always.
And as I said, it goes back to stretching the resources, and depending on the company, the structure, and the resources that they have, it becomes, a defining factor on how well they can adapt these, right? But something I always like to ask leaders, and especially given that you're a director within the customer success function, with the rise of remote working, how do you approach supporting your customers and supporting your team?
So I think I mean, one, I as soon as the pandemic happened, as soon as they told us we were working from home, I packed a bag and I went remote. I left New York behind. I kind of was with my parents at my parents' place for a little while, and then kind of found my feet in Los Angeles. And we were sort of in a world where customers didn't really always want to meet in person anymore. I think pre-pandemic there was much more aptitude and appetite for it. Like, people wanted to go out to dinner and have a drink, and you wanted to go and visit customers, and it was also easier because they were typically more consolidated. Now, if I want to go visit one of my customers, it's like, are you going to be in the office that day? Are you going to have to come in for me? Or, are you going to already be there? Also, do you even live in that city, or do I have to plan it around like when you're going to be visiting your own headquarters? Um, so I think it's just built in a lot of complexity, and because of the complexity, people just don't have the same appetite for it. Um, so we've really kind of leaned in like webinars, master classes a little bit, finding these like points in time where we can bring customers in to have these conversations, also for efficiency. Do you have to have the same conversation with everybody individually, or is it something that can kind of be done at scale a little bit more? And then, from the supporting our team perspective, there were people that went remote, and you again, I'm in that bucket, so I'm very susceptible. I'm very sensitive to it, and I understand kind of the differences. Like, it's really important to make people feel a part of the team, and to be able to come in and contribute and like enjoy that connection with everybody else. But I think people are also asking, like, well, why do I need to be in the office? And that answer is not always as obvious, because it depends on people's priorities and everything. So um, it kind of depends. I think we've sort of settled back into a few days a week in the office, and it works pretty well for most people, um, with a few exceptions.
And would you say that the way that you support these accounts that the apps flyer have hasn't changed since pre-pandemic till now? The way that support's offered and the customer success team works with them hasn't altered much, just in the sense where maybe you haven't got to travel too much, but they're getting the same treatment, the same care, the same approach. There's nothing that's changed from their side.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, like, I think if anything, we've added a bit more webinar type material, master classes where customers can come in and get training on a topic at a certain time. Also, more intentional on events. So, we'll do one of our biggest events is Mobile Apps Unlocked in Las Vegas, and that's an event where I probably have 15 customer meetings. And that's where we plan to see them now, not necessarily always down the street in the office or at the regular events that we used to go to. So yeah, I would say that they've kind of been able to get that service the same. And we have customers all across the country, so um, if anything, I'd probably visit them slightly less, and they seem to be okay with it.
And I guess managing customer success in such a dynamic world of analytics must present its own unique challenges, right? And I'd love for you just to elaborate a little bit on some of these challenges that you may face, and the strategies that you and the team are employing to overcome them, and make sure that the customers are satisfied and getting the best service.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because I always kind of take parallels back to other industries in terms of customer success
Yeah.
and how I think about things. So I know before we were on here, we were talking about motorcycles, and I bought a motorcycle from a company, and it was brand new. They had just released it, and the service was not great. They didn't know any of the details about the bike, like they hadn't had the time to get familiar with it, and on one hand, I was really frustrated with them, and on the other hand, I was like, this is the perpetual problem of releasing a new product. And we release new products all the time as a software organization. And it doesn't have to be once a year. It could be every 6 months or every 2 months. And it's definitely a challenge because, I mean, one, you have to learn a completely new tool or product. The industry is constantly changing. So for us, Apple introduces changes, and it was chaos when Apple introduced the iOS 14 changes. We were unsure how to deal with it from a product perspective early on. So we had to kind of listen in, get feedback, and kind of approach it that way. But there was also a lot of fear and uncertainty because we weren't sure what Apple would actually do at the end of the day. And so you're managing change, you're managing fear, you're managing uncertainty, and you're also doing it kind of with a brave face to look good in front of your customers. And so I think one of the things I always tried to hire for from the beginning was curiosity, like people that were interested in finding out what the next thing is, or when somebody asked a question, thinking about, well, why does it matter? What are you trying to accomplish? Where does that get you to? And I think that's also a natural uh, remedy in some ways to the uncertainty and the fear and the anxiety of the unknown, because you're kind of tackling it head first and you're embracing it. And the people who are embracing it are the ones that everybody's going to come to look for solutions. And so, as things get harder and more complicated and the industry changes and so on, I mean, it's really just an opportunity for us to step out in front and hopefully be able to show that we are best in class in this and that we understand it better than anybody else. So, with iOS 14, I probably had conversations with 100 plus customers at various points in time, back to back to back, just talking about how things would work and what the tech would look like and what the implications would be and the privacy component of it. Um, and so, to deal with it with our customer success team, the type of people that we hire, obviously, like I mentioned, having regular trainings and check-ins. Like we literally have a weekly product update meeting that is just a free meeting where we look at the latest product updates, or we do a training on certain things that have come out, or just look at the industry as a whole. Um, if you're kind of in a world where you think that everything's going to stay the same and you just want to keep doing it, that's not going to work. But it's also, again, like kind of great for like personal interest and autonomy, because suddenly it's not just like, oh, I'm doing the same thing I've been doing for the past 10 years. It's like, well, actually, I'm learning new things. The industry is changing. I'm evolving. I'm learning how to tackle new problems. And I think it's just inherently more rewarding. And it keeps our profile of our company much more focused on being flexible and growing and adapting and, moving on to the next challenge. So I think it serves us kind of top to bottom.
And just before I ask the next question, you just going back to the example you gave, what bike was it that you bought that they were having problems with describing and giving you an overview and answering any questions you had?
Well, yeah, okay. Well, not to talk bad about Harley by any means, but they just released it was the 2021 Sportster S. It was brand new engine, 120 horsepower, super powerful motor that they had just kind of come out with, and the bike had a few niggling problems here and there. And one of the things that I heard from people was like, don't buy vehicles in general during that were made during the pandemic because of all the shortages and the labor shortages and all that stuff. So the construction of those. One of my friends knows somebody who runs a truck business and said all his vehicles that had problems were 2021s. So suffice to say, it was a 2021. It was full of problems, but Harley did me right. They were really good. They actually gave me a brand new bike, 2022, after all the issues, and I haven't had a problem yet, and I haven't had to put down $1 on to get the trade in, so I can't complain.
And that's it goes back to customer service, right? They acknowledged there was issues and they made sure that at the end of the day you were happy with what you got, and they did everything they could to find a solution for you. And everyone knows Harley Davidson. It's a big brand. It's been around for a while. It's a desired bike by many people, especially if you're on the West Coast and that sunshine. So I'm glad you're getting to enjoy it now. And just if we move away
Yeah.
from that, if we talk about what you was just mentioning a moment ago, what would be any proven strategies or best practices that you and the team are implementing just to ensure high customer satisfaction and high retention rates as well? Because we all know how important they are for growing businesses to stay at the top.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, here it's like it's not rocket science. I kind of lean on a few best practices. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned Harley and what they did with customer service. Like I look at traditional customer service as good examples all the time. Danny Meyer, the guy who created Shake Shack, he wrote a book about hospitality. And hospitality, I think, also gives you that emphasis on that personal touch, like dealing with issues and working with people kind of on a human scale, rather than just kind of being stuck in the rigidity of process. So I think one of the things that he uh, sort of talks about, which is really uh, been something that I kind of try to stick close to, is he talks about whatever happens, like you're always going to deal with issues, you're always going to run into things, but at the end of the day, how do you rewrite the ending? How do you make sure that the final say that that customer has to experience is a positive one? So, in his example, maybe food goes wrong, but at the end of the day, they will enjoy their experience, they will have a good meal, and they'll be kind of happy with what they came out with. And so that's where I always try to think about it. Like, how do we drive our customers there? But it starts with the beginning, which is the implementation and the onboarding, that kind of clean handover and understanding of what customers do. Honestly, I think we could do a better job of it. But we're kind of doubling down on it and saying like, okay, what do we need to make sure our customers onboard successfully? How do we reduce that time to value? For some people, it's a really easy conversation of time to value, really simple. You just set up this and you're going to immediately get value. Well, for us, you have to implement an SDK. You have to start running campaigns. You have to start looking at your data. So it's not as easy to make sure somebody is even getting to that point. And so that's a really key part of it for us. We, again, we're really tightly integrated with our product and engineering team. So one, we have to make sure we are reviewing any issues on a basically biweekly basis. We'll go through any risk customers, and we have a basically assignment system where if a customer is at risk because of a product issue, the product team is assigned that in our reporting tool, and they own it. Is it a pricing issue? The sales team will own it, and so on. And so basically making it really clear what the issue is, who the owner is, and how we kind of follow up on that, I think becomes really critical. One of the things that I think I again, going back to like traditional customer service, there was an analysis done, I think, by Gartner several years ago, and they talked about the profile of a successful customer service person, like what their personality like, how do they deal with customers? And I think a lot of people naturally assume that the customer success person that's more successful is the empathetic one, the one that's listening and paying attention to the customer and sort of that ear to complain to and kind of talk to. But in their analysis, it's actually the characteristic that they described as the rock that's the most, or sorry, the controller, not the rock, that they are the rock, the controller that is the most successful customer success person. And that person is driving outcomes. They're saying, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to accomplish it. They're not just listening to problems. They're saying, how do we get you closer to a solution? And what that also means is sometimes they're not just giving you, hey, here's a few options, do what you want. They're saying, I think this is what you should do, and let's get you towards it. And that's, I think, really well reflected in the modern parlance that we have in customer success, business desired outcomes. Where you're saying, what are you trying to accomplish, and how am I actually helping make sure you get there? And I think that's what we're really trying to double down on as well.
And I talk to a lot of leaders day in, day out, and I guess empathy is something more and more that leaders are driving the importance of, and that's something you just mentioned there again. So I know it's definitely something that's climbing up the ladder as one of the top priorities in any organization. And I guess as companies like AppsFlyer scale and you have some small customers and some large customers, I always like to find out, things like how you are able to balance personalization of supporting the individual customers and scaling customer success initiatives to cater for a larger customer base, as it must be tricky.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's fun because I think what often happens is you sort of like look at the landscape in front of you and you see what are my issues or what are my challenges and how am I trying to address it. And if you want to talk about like the stratification of customers and how we work with them, early on it was this, like we were very customer success focused. We'd throw a CSM at everything. But if you look at the amount of time and the value coming back from what a customer success person is doing, it's obviously not equivalent based on every single situation. And so obviously this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but you kind of break out like how valuable are your engagements with customers? Okay, you can only have so many engagements. How many are you having with your top tier customers? How many are you having with the most important ones? How many are you having with the least important ones? And how do you almost like rearrange that to say, do we want to spend more time with our most important customers? What do we do to do that? And so for us, and I know this is kind of becoming pretty standard, it has been pretty standard for a while, is we created like a scale function where kind of a lower tier of customer, maybe they don't need as much hand holding, they're not as sophisticated, they don't pay for as many tools or features that we offer. They're going to be put into that kind of lower tier scale bucket. And it will be, they won't have a direct CSM to engage with, but they'll have like a service email. And that email will be supported, or that email chain will be supported by a group of CSMs that are handling those types of accounts. And so they're already specialized for the category of customer and the strength of like what they might need typically. Then that frees up the mass of the rest of the CSMs to focus on those more high touch accounts, and also to be more specific with them. So we're kind of breaking it out in two further delineations. One is kind of industry specifications of specialists. So a CSM might know the e-commerce vertical really well, so they can work with other e-commerce type customers, deal with the same kinds of issues. I have a CSM dealing with 3 or 4 different customers, and they all have a very similar product issue. And it's so much easier that it's with one person rather than kind of spread out among 5 or 6 different people. Similarly, we're also kind of exploring the idea of like more pod structure alignment, where we would have a CSM connect directly with an AM and work on that account, because then all those engagements, all those conversations, they can be done kind of with a smaller group of people that know how to work together and that know how to work with those customers in that group.
So just on what you mentioned, it's fair to say that you have a few customer success managers that are very much focused on specific verticals, so they kind of know that the general problems that the customers in that space are facing, whether they're automotive, for example, obviously not in this case, but like commerce or retail or CPG, you have specific like specialists that are covering those verticals to make sure that they can kind of pull together all their knowledge to solve the problems, rather than having somebody that has to then go and do the research, understand what the typical problems are and help them to solve it, just for an efficiency purpose. Is that right? And to ensure the
Yeah,
success.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and it comes and goes depending on our expertise on the CS team and what makes sense. But gaming is a really strong vertical for us, so we have a lot of focus on those gaming customers. E-commerce is a big one. Finance or fintech has been one that also comes up, and it's hard because you look at the spread of your customers. Like, there's a lot of diversity just inherently in the verticals, in the size, in the profile, in the expertise, in the needs that they have out of the product. And so you kind of have to find ways just to simplify it and say, like, what can we categorize a few people into and know, that we're going to get this out of them.
And on the topic of customer loyalty, then how important is it to maintain that, and how are you able to reinforce the loyalty and sustain those different robust relationships with the different types of customers?
Yeah, I mean, that's super critical. Obviously, in any SaaS business, it's like that's one of the key metrics. Net retention and gross retention are huge for us. And as we try to be best in class in SaaS in general, like, those are some of the key metrics that we look at and explore. And I think it's it, it's I mean, it's even just a simple math equation where you think about, like, all right, you acquire a customer, that's an expensive process in itself. But how long you keep the customer is going to be more valuable than just signing them up for a year. So if you can keep a customer for 5 years, you're making so much more money off that one single customer that took you so much effort to acquire compared to maintain. And so, like, it's always been naturally inherent in, like, the way that we work, again, because we've always had very strong emphasis on customer success and customer service. But from a numbers perspective, I mean, you can't grow a critical business without it. I think I mentioned earlier, we build to what our customers are asking for. So it's not like it's bespoke so that it only works for them. It makes our whole product better. And so if a specific gaming customer wants us to implement this feature, one, it means our competitors don't have the feature. Two, it means that everybody else that we work with also gets the value out of it. And it also kind of asserts, like, the investment that we put into our product team. And so that is a really key part of it, for us, where you have to have that relationship where you're improving your tool based on what those customers need. Not everybody needs that. And then the other thing maybe that I would kind of add to that is, like, the relationship piece is still hugely hugely important. Um, you know you you have a product that needs servicing and supporting, and the way that I always think about it is, again, going back to traditional customer service. If I called that hotline, like, let's say it's my airline and I have an issue with my flight, and they're helpful, I'm going to talk to them again. I'm going to have a relationship with them again. I'm going to know what to expect from them when I work with them. And if I don't like what I get back from that hotline, I'm probably never going to call them again. I'm not going to wait in line. I'm on the phone. I'm not going to engage. And then it becomes a different discussion. It becomes, is that a better price than the other one? It's not just about that relationship and the connection. So I think being able to enforce that is super critical, just in general, rather than making it like, oh, you're the cheapest product, so that's what I'm going to go with.
And with the products that AppsFly started with initially, and now we fast forward, many years later, I guess customers have been fundamental in sharing ideas on new features and products that they would like to see. And I guess, has that led to the drive of developing the new products on the roadmap? And if you look at how important customer feedback has been, and looking at the analytics behind it, of course, you need to have enough demand. was that instrumental in driving those strategies and enhancing the product over time, I guess?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned that earlier, but what I would say is that we've built so closely towards what our customers have asked
Yeah.
for in the past. I mean, we have basically internal reports with product requests where a CSM will submit a product request and they'll attach their accounts to it. So what a product person sees is here's something that would be beneficial for us to build, and also here are all the accounts and all the revenue attached to that request that we should help prioritize. And so it's really easy for us to kind of put data behind it and provide that back to our team. Um, Obviously, if it's something that's a little bit more urgent, we can deal with it sort of with our relationships with the product team and knowing how to escalate issues there. But yeah, that's a super key part of it. Where it's been interesting is as we become more mature, and again, as the industry has changed, we've had to sort of look at ways of being a little bit more innovative and trying to come up with new solutions to problems. We've started to leverage like data clean rooms, for instance, and that's not a problem that people were asking us specifically for that solution for before. It's a different way of looking at some of the problems that customers have, and so that becomes a little bit more of a conversation on how do we roll this out, how do we educate the market, and that's it's slower. It's not as easy as the previous conversations.
Great. And as we look, to where we are today, there's a growing need for automation and AI, and many companies are implementing it for their ticketing and help desk area of the business. Now, how does AppsFly strike that balance between having, some sort of some AI versus human interaction, and being able to really personalize that support for the customers?
Yeah, we've actually tested it out a little bit. We have a integration with ChatGPT and those tools where we can kind of like put in all of our support docs and knowledge base information and everything and sort of see how well they answer questions. It's been a little bit early, I think, for some of those tools to be good enough to sort of replace CS specific support. I think where we're seeing it on our side is more maybe tools that are a little bit more established already, like a Pendo, where you can kind of have
Yeah.
that flow of conversation moving through. So I think we're testing it out for sure, and we're looking at it. And actually, our data cleanroom solution that I mentioned a moment ago, that actually does have a ChatGPT integration, which is super cool. But there's a lot more that we can do with that for sure.
And there's always, I guess, a measure of measuring the cost effectiveness versus how scalable it is. And then you look at, things like hallucination within AI now. And that's obviously a big topic of discussion for companies when they look at implementing AI or generative AI solutions, right? So that's obviously something of a big talking point at the moment. So I guess, as you mentioned, over time, only time will tell if it's something that the company implements and if it will bring massive value. And just as we come towards wrapping up, what I always like to ask again is, as a leader now, when you're, looking to grow your team, is there any key initiatives that you drive to help to elevate and enable them to grow and have a clear kind of pathway to success and grow their career?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things. One is like clear OKRs, because I think what happens as the team gets bigger, it becomes more and more important to have standard expectations across everybody. Like, how are you even having that promotion conversation or growth conversation? But it's also like I try to look at it from a motivation and personal interest perspective. Like, where are you trying to go and how do we get you there? I worked with a leader in the past who used to use this term like tours of duty. It's like where you are right now, it may not be exactly where you want to be, but what are we going to do here that will serve you in the future? And I think that's kind of the lesson of my career too, with being an AppsFlyer, which is that like I didn't have to help out on the sales side at all. I could have just been a customer success person. But by taking those different initiatives on one hand, I probably wasted a little bit of time, potentially a lot of time, but on the other, it allowed me to learn skills and traits and develop expertise that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so I think when I look at where people are going, I always try to think about how you can align their interests, their motivations with the value that they could provide. Because if those two things are out of line, you're going to be kind of rubbing against something in a way that's not going to work long term. Um, so, I mean, to be honest, it's often just an individual conversation with people, and their interests kind of take shape organically sometimes and with different projects. But yeah, we have a lot of initiatives in our organization. We're always changing. We're always trying to do things better and differently, and that allows people to sort of play around with product projects or organizational products or changing how we do a certain thing. And I'd like to think, I mean, one, it gave me a lot of energy and focus and ability to provide impact when I was kicking off. But I think it also allows a lot of the other people on the team to do that too.
And is there any type of mentorship program for employees within the organization for them to pair up with somebody and gain, a different perspective and support in their journey to grow?
So there's two things that we've done, which I haven't seen in many other organizations, but that I really appreciate. One is we've partnered up with Better Up, I think that's what it's called, where they can work with like an external coach. We have a limited number of seats for that, but just having that kind of voice in their ear that they can work with. And then we've also, as of this year, we've started training internal coaches too. And so actually, I got to be in one of the programs where we trained to be coaches, and now I'm actually acting as a coach for people in our organization. And so having that person just be sort of a sounding board and kind of a regular check-in to be able to kind of talk about the future. Yeah, that's something I've personally paid for in the past. And I love that we're doing that for our team.
That's amazing. And empowering your team, I guess, is always crucial. And, I always hear the discussion about manager versus leader. And personally, I think leader sounds like more along the right lines when you think of giving a lot of responsibility and trust to your teams. And that's how you really get the most out of them in most situations. Now, can you provide any examples where you've personally been able to enable your team to grow and to thrive, especially in a dynamic and changing environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, Apple's changes were a big example of that too. I mean, there was again when they announced like the iOS 14 and ATT changes and everything, it was a really fearful moment for the industry because they just didn't know what it meant, and there was uncertainty, and marketers didn't know how things would even work anymore. Would they be able to get the data that they needed? And I think at the end of the day, you can kind of choose to either react to something and just wait till it comes out and you have to deal with it, or you can kind of proactively take control in the situation. And I think one of the benefits of being that person that takes control, and control is a bad word, but what it does is it sort of allows you to be a focal point. And so when people are talking about iOS 14, they would come to the person who's talking the most about it and who's paying the most attention to it and who's providing the most resources to everybody else about it. And you kind of almost become a lightning rod for creative ideas and for learning. And it actually allows you to be, I think, more and more successful just by being the person that has been attached to that and everybody kind of coming to you naturally. And so, that was kind of a point for me where, again, I was on, probably at some points I was on 5 to 8 calls a day with customers, just talking to them about how it worked. And customer success people, they didn't want to be wrong. They didn't know how to navigate this conversation of uncertainty with expertise. Um, and so that was kind of a moment where we had that. But long term, uh, as fun as it is to kind of be able to work with customers and help them in those in like difficult moments, it's so critical to ultimately enable the CSMs themselves to be able to do that. And so the next step is, okay, you can have all those great conversations, but the longer you have them, the more you're failing. And so what are the steps you can kind of take to enable the team? So regular trainings. That's how we started those product update meetings that I mentioned earlier, just based on all the updates that were there. Um, and and just continuous enablement resources and projects that challenge people's ability to understand and to work with their customers through like product adoption initiatives and things like that. So
Yeah, I think enablement's key, and even what you mentioned there about the regular product kind of meetups to discuss ways that they can improve it and challenges. These are things that every company I think should be doing if they're not already. Most are, but this is something the more frequently you can do it within reason, I guess, the more fast, the quicker you can action the changes and make sure that the improvements are being done to keep them very competitive in the market. And just as we come towards closing, a question I have for every leader, I guess, because people that want to move into leadership, they want to know, lessons that they can learn without having to make the mistake themselves. So, what would be one of the big lessons that you would say you've learned in your quest as a leader and over the last 8 years at AppsFlyer?
yeah, honestly, I hinted at it earlier, but I think like being being willing to take things on even when they're a little bit out of your scope. And that's what I think is so great about being in a startup in general, is that there's not always as clear definitions on who should take things. There's a lot of things that fall between the cracks. And like I said, you're going to waste a little bit of time, but a lot of that will also just go to learning and development. And I think one of the mistakes that a lot of people make is they think you'll get rewarded by your company and then you'll do the work. But a lot of times, what happens, for better or worse, I won't weigh in on that, is that you will get rewarded for the things that you show that you can do. And so I think sometimes people hold themselves back because they think, oh, it's not worth my time. I'm not getting paid for it. It's not in my scope and nobody will care. And yeah, it might take time for people to care. They might not do it within 5 months. They might not do it within 6 months. But if you are consistently doing good work beyond what's expected of you, then it will ultimately get rewarded. And also examine who is getting rewarded. One of the things that I did was I was like, how do I get to that next level? Who are the people that are in our org that have gotten there? And I interviewed them and I sat down with them. I was like, what are the things that you feel like you did that helped you get to that point? And tried to make some kind of common, uh, you know, themes and consistencies and borrowed a little bit of advice. Like people have done it before. You don't have to always go alone, but find find the reason why you should be doing more things or things that would benefit you and benefit the team. Because if you enjoy them and you're doing them of your own volition, that's going to be so much better than just suffering through whatever somebody assigns you.
And it goes back again to what you said earlier about curiosity, right? You need to be willing to want to go that bit further, learn, different things that maybe you don't know and make yourself a better person at your job. So that's great to hear. And just last of all, before we dive into the quick fire questions and for me to share the question from the last guest is the MarTech space is so big and it's growing very quickly now for companies in their early stage of their journey, what would you say is one thing that they can't afford to get wrong when they're building their brand and their reputation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think honestly, having a good path to feedback and improve is one of those. Like our industry is small, and for us, the people that we work with are people we're going to work with again. So you can't just say, "Oh, you're at a small company, you're not important." Like how you treat those people will be important when they get moved up to a bigger company. I actually have plenty of examples of this too. Like we had a customer, he actually worked in our building. He would come by our office. He was paying very little, but we always try to make sure treated him with as much respect as we possibly could and give him as much time. And he ended up being hired by one of the fintech companies that we work for with that was a little bit bigger of a contract, but he had a great relationship with us, and that kind of carried over. So I think at the end of the day, especially depending on your industry, but in ours, it's a small world. People talk. They know who they like. They know who sounds like they know what they're talking about, and you can't really fake that.
Amazing. And as we dive into the quick fire questions, Tony, I've got three questions for you. So the first one would be, are you a pet person? And if so, what is your favorite pet?
I had I'm not a pet person. I was a pet kid. I had every level of pet you could imagine growing up. I had a pet monkey in middle school, which was probably one of the worst pets I've ever had. But that's probably a story for another day. Probably the best. Honestly, I love dogs. You can't go wrong with a good dog.
The cat dog discussion goes on. It's always something of a mixed bag. And if we go to the next question, which would be what's your favorite food? If you could make something, or if you go and get a takeaway, what's your favorite meal?
Honestly, this is going to sound terrible, but they are a customer of mine, so I could say this. Sweet green, farm to table salads, quick service. I could eat it probably every single day for the rest of my life. Um, and they're based out here in LA, so perfect.
Amazing. And the last question I have is, if you are a sports fan, what would you say is your favorite team?
I mean, it's got to be Arsenal. I don't know. I am always a little bit careful who I'm saying that to because I think you mentioned you're a Chelsea fan. Got some Tottenham fans around. But I fell in love with them in, the early 2000s when they were having their rivalries with United, and we're doing better than they are, so I can't complain.
Great. And I guess soccer's getting bigger and bigger over in the States. So I know lots of people are starting to get involved in soccer, which is nice. And as we move towards the question from the last guest, Tony, the question I have for you would be, as a people's manager, what is the hardest part of your job?
Ooh, honestly, I think probably the hardest part of my job is balancing between uh, helping people when they need it and enabling them to not need you. It's like it's a great day when nobody reaches out to me, but it's also like, am I doing enough to help them out? And finding that balance because you don't want to do the work for them and you don't want everybody to need you all the time because that means you have some failure somewhere. But it is nice to be able to help people out occasionally, and that's what I get value out of being a customer success. So that's probably the hardest.
And hopefully there's not too much large escalations where you need to get involved in. So as you said, you know you're doing a good job and you can let them be self-sufficient, which is amazing. But Tony, just before I let you go, what would be a question that you want to leave for the next guest?
Yeah, so I was thinking about it kind of in the spirit of what we were talking about earlier. What would you do, or what would happen if your customer success team disappeared tomorrow? What would that look like?
I'll definitely be sure to ask that next. But Tony, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. I hope you have a great day and enjoy the weekend too.
You too, Paris. Have a great weekend. Thanks for chatting. Appreciate it.
Thanks again. Bye bye now.